It's Second Look. I'm Neil Atkinson, Mo Stewart and Adam Smith with me to talk about Liverpool's defeat, of all things, to Atletico Madrid. Liverpool went to Madrid last night, got beat by 1-0. And in talking about the game, Mo, the first thing to talk about in the context of the way in which the whole thing plays out is that 5th minute goal. It changes everything. It gets Atletico the early reward they would have wanted, but it very much sort of formalises their mindset. I think they would have had a big 15, say, and then dropped. As it is, they have a big 7 and then drop, and that just sets the entire way the game's going to play out from that point.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't even make any kind of... They made it really obvious that was exactly what they wanted to do. That was all they wanted to do, and then this is phase 2 of their plan. It was just to not let us score whatsoever. From Liverpool's perspective, you look at the nature of the goal and you think, oh, okay, it's not a massive mistake. It's just one of those things that can happen. So you think it shouldn't have deflated them too much, but I feel like it might have done. I feel like it might have got into our heads to think, okay, now we've got to climb this mountain. We've got to be sharper. And it didn't really play out that way. It was almost like they were feeling things that they had to do, but they couldn't quite get to do them.
It's one of those things that, you know, if you're a footballer, the one thing you'll all be saying to each other, maybe even if the manager himself hasn't said it to you, is don't let them have an early goal. And then they get an early goal. And I think I think it does take Liverpool almost 15 minutes after that point to almost get past the fact that this has happened, Adam. And I think that is something to think about. We haven't really seen this side have to deal with adversity for a while. When it has this season, it's done brilliantly, but it's the first time in a while they've had any level of adversity to deal with.
Yeah, and I think Mo's exactly right. You feel like it shouldn't have deflated them as much as it did, but I think that message of no early goal will have been so drilled into them that the second early goal goes in, they're like, what do we do now? What's the next plan? And they've become very adept at solving things on the pitch. But I think whatever walk of life you're in, whatever job you've got, however good you are at solving problems, when the one thing you've been drilled to not happens, there has to be a moment of, what's next then? Like, I know we've got to score, but obviously we need to keep it tight, don't we?
Do you think you see that, Adam, and it's interesting because he is the one person you wouldn't expect to see it in the 15 minutes that Van Dijk has after that point? Because I think it's arguably, the first 30 minutes is arguably, and it's no disrespect to him because there's been very few poor ones, but it's arguably the worst 30 minutes he has in a Liverpool shirt.
Yeah, and I think it won't have helped him in that sense that it kind of was his fault that it happened, because he gave the corner away, didn't he, when he could have booted it out maybe for another throw or whatever it might be. I think there's also
that the scene of the crime when the ball's in the back of the net.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. He's the closest. So all of those things together, and that kind of, well, I'm the fella whose job it is to make sure they don't score an early goal and get my defence in line. And it's sort of all my fault that they've scored an early goal.
Even though it wasn't.
No, of course it was. But if you're a human being, you're sitting there going, it's my fault. And I think he shakes it off because it isn't his fault. And, you know, he's a professional. He's very good at what he does. So I think he does manage to kind of get rid of that feeling. But for a time, I think they were all kind of going, I don't know what the next plan is. You know, how do we the number one aim now we've got is to score, try and get an away goal, get things level. But we don't want to leave ourselves exposed because 1 or 2 times they've looked like they're going to get in behind us. So, yeah.
I think one of the things it shows us, Mo, is it reminds us about, and again, a lot of this can sound banal if you're not careful, but it actually reminds you about the knife edge you play European football on. Because one of the things I start thinking at 1-0 is just don't let them get another. Because suddenly 2-0 feels completely different. And that then also looms large last 10, when I think that Atletico did begin, if you go all the way to the end of the game, that last 10, I think Atletico began to think Simeone maybe was going, right now, as they're tired, they've thrown everything at it, they're a bit demoralised, let's see if we can get the second. But I was really thinking, just do not concede another. But that's the knife edge of this, whereas if it was a league game, it's easy just to say, we just throw the kitchen sink at them and see what happens to the other side.
I mean, the biggest example of that, I know we're going to talk about substitutions later in the show, but the fact that Klopp wasn't willing to risk Mane getting a red card. It's like, no, there's another whole game for us to win this in, so we're going to take him off now and make sure that whatever we do here, we can get it back in the next leg. And I think at that point in the last 10, when they did start going again, it really started to remind me of Napoli away in the first game of the Champions League, because that's exactly what they did. They put that pressure on once our frustration had got to the point and we felt like we'd almost punched ourselves out, because at that point in the game, we weren't still creating chances. It wasn't like, there were periods in the game where it's like, one's coming. That wasn't one of those periods.
On that idea of, and I think again, this is something which is worth bearing in mind into how the game plays out. It reminded me a little if you take the scoreline away of the first leg of the last 16 last season against Munich, where Liverpool in the first half create a couple of opportunities, don't really convert them, and then we get to about 20 to go and it's almost like both sides don't really entirely know what to do. And then Munich began to sort of come alive a tiny bit, not enough I'd say, in the last 10 of that first leg, and Liverpool were almost like, we'll just take 0-0. I think the extent to which Liverpool take 1-0 second half has actually been understated retrospectively. I think Liverpool, after they have the big push after the break, they then get to about 60, 65, and I think Liverpool are almost happy to say, all right, we've had a bit of a go tonight, we'll see what happens next.
No, that's a really good point. And referencing that Munich game, the thing that I always remember about that, in that moment, where it's almost like Bayern realised that we're happy with a 0-0, and then it makes them feel like, wait, why are they happy? Maybe we should score. And it kind of makes them think differently about what they're doing and what their MO was. But from our perspective in this game, you could tell very much that, like we said, Atletico's plan doesn't change at all, really, from the moment they've got their goal. It's like they're focusing in on the 0. Whereas for us, it's slightly different because you do think an away goal makes you more comfortable. It means that you don't go into the second leg with a situation where if they get another fluky early goal, perhaps, then we've got the mountain of 3 goals to climb against a really good defence. But they weren't really as bothered about that. For us, it was kind of like, we trust Anfield now. We trust our attackers now. We will be able to go out there and blitz them regardless, as long as there's only one.
Well, Mo mentions the substitutions there, and they do both tell a very specific story, I think, Adam. Before we get into specific things Atletico did after the insert, I think there's something around the substitution of Mane is, we do not want to risk this. And then the substitution of Salah is a reminder. Liverpool played Saturday, Atletico played Friday. Liverpool played Saturday and they played 5:30 on Saturday. And that to me looked so pre-programmed. It's ridiculous that basically someone said to the manager, this fella can do 70, beyond 70 he goes into the red. There's a long season to come. You know, if that was a final, Salah doesn't come off. No. But the reality is that Liverpool are making a decision based upon the weeks and months to come, not just off last night's game. Yeah,
and I think that's what the manager has done time and time again when he's been at Liverpool. You know, we people talk about the rustiness after the mid-season break. The manager's aware of that. He can't look at what happened last season and not be aware that they're a little bit rusty. But he also will look at last season and went, but look at the run we went on once we got back into rhythm, because they were rested, because they were okay. He's constantly thinking further down the line. And obviously, he says one game at a time. We all know that's nonsense. There's absolutely no way he takes Mo Salah off last night if he's only thinking one game at a time. He's not. He's thinking about, well, there's no point in us saying we'll do them in the second leg if Mo Salah's injured because I've played him for 90 here tonight when I've been told he can only really do 75. It's a decision that makes complete sense in what comes next, and I think that the same is true in a much shorter term of the Mane decision, where he's gone, well, what comes next is them doing every trick in the book to get Mane sent off, and I trust him, but this ref is a load of bin bags dressed up in a shirt. There's no point in, I'm not trusting him. So, you know, I think, I'm quite sure he said to Mane, it's not, I've got no problem with you, I know you'll make it through without getting a second yellow, but this fella hasn't got a clue. So he's made the decision for what comes next to the second half. I don't think necessarily that Origi was the right sub, but taking Mane off was. So that's the best that he can do in that moment, isn't it?
Just do that quickly on Origi coming on. Mo, he looked to me like in flashes. Straight after, when he gets on for the first time, you think, yep, Divok's on this today. And then it wanes. And then he goes through the middle and you think, no, all right, now Divok's going to come alive. And then it wanes. I think he's another one who's not entirely helped by the situation that he comes on into. But it would be nice to see maybe a tiny little bit more from him.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like you say, when he came on, you could see what his plans were, what his instructions were. It was to try to commit defenders and try as much as possible to stay wide, help us keep the pitch as wide as possible, make sure when they're having to cover us, they are having to do a lot of running. And he kind of did that. I think like his first 2 duels against the right back, he didn't win. And then from that point on, he was always looking inside.
And he just dropped deep. And there's a point where Robertson picks it up and the camera angle was great. Robertson's got it left back position on his foot and he's going to Divok, get away from me, get away from me. There's no, don't come in and show feet. You're meant to be on his shoulder, making the pitch massive.
Exactly, and you can see him screaming at him, run, run. You might as well throw Forrest in there for all the good it did. But I think that was another, when Origi was coming deep, it's something that Josh mentioned earlier on when we were talking about Talking Reds, is that the idea, we kind of went a bit positionless at a point in the second half where it was just like, everyone was just popping up everywhere. It's just like, we're just going to try and do something different to see if we can get a bit of a crack of a gap happening. And it just wasn't happening. And there was lots of people where balls weren't quite as crisp as they needed to be, touches weren't quite as sharp as they needed to be. And when you're playing against a team that's so set defensively and so, on top of it, so intense, if they just get the slightest snap, then they're right in there and taking the ball away.
Okay, Tactics Board, back in a second. So what do Atletico do well? The first thing I think they do well is basically say they want the football match to be played in this strip. Once they get 1-0 up, they're almost quite happy to have the football match be played here. Just right the way along there, if you can see it, and that's where most of our counters come in terms of average position. So it doesn't take much to imagine that Fabinho is in there, and as we're going to go on to talk about, that you've got these two coming and snapping back at people's heels either side, and they're coming back in there as well. So then our two move up here to around there, and suddenly we're able to say that with the exception of the two centre-halves, and certainly second half when Origi starts coming in and dropping deep, you end up in a situation where Firmino comes and drops deep as well, and you've got just Salah up until the 70th minute mark, and practically everyone's playing the football along this line here, and that's where Atleti want to make it crowded. Where they didn't want it to be crowded, which is what happened at the start of the second half, is when there's a lot of balls knocking around in the penalty area. That was where they were on the back foot, and where, you know, as much as you can talk about good rearguard actions, if your reliance is a bit of pinball going your way, that's not a good rearguard action. But this is good defensive work from Atletico Madrid, and they'll be absolutely delighted that they managed to sort of keep Liverpool in this area. They're the Blues, by the way, we're the Reds. I should have said that at the start, but you know by now that we're always the Reds. So it was all this in here. Keep it snappy, keep it moving around at people, charging them down, closing them where you need to, coming back in here, then occasionally getting moved out, trying to be compact, but it is like a line of six. Move these two back out, those two in there. This is where Koke ends up. You've got Versalco over there. Koke ends up in here. Lamar pulls wide first half, but goes off at half time because they want to be even more compact. And then Koke comes over to this side, comes compact. Llorente's in there, compact. And you've got these six here trying to make sure that these Liverpool players can never settle and can never play. They do really, really well, to be honest with you, at that. But I'll say it again. If your reliance is getting out of the phases where the ball's bouncing around your penalty area, then that's not really when it's working. But when it was working was when the game was pinned here. Welcome back. Talked about what Atletico Madrid did there. And Atleti, they find themselves in this situation, Mo, where, or more accurately, Liverpool find themselves in a situation where I think there'll now be a lot of opposition coaches looking at the video and saying, what did they do? In the same way that I got the impression Atleti had a little look at Napoli and went, what did they do? And how can we replicate it? I think the first thing to point out is what Atleti do very well. They do very well in a tactical setup that involves also having really, really, really good players. Really, really fit players, really, really big players. It's not dissimilar to Napoli. It's a very muscular four-man midfield. A four-man midfield that can cover the ground of six between them as they share the load. And I think that that's the first thing that they do, is that when Liverpool try to make the pitch big, they're able to respond relatively quickly. Not perfectly, but relatively quickly.
Yeah, and Liverpool, when they've been faced with these kind of things in the past, they normally try to outlast them and just think, okay, if we just keep moving the ball around as quickly as we can, eventually they're not going to be able to be as sharp. They're going to give us a half a yard. The places are going to slightly open up, and that's when we can pounce. But I don't know whether it was the lead, the crowd, their general fitness, or all of the above.
The fact that they had a day's more recovery.
They had a day's more recovery. All of these things meant that they knew that we were waiting for them to tire, so they just weren't willing to let that happen, and they just absolutely dogged it out. And it was very impressive from their perspective, you have to admit. I still think that if we were at a higher level of sharpness, we would have been able to crack that net.
I think there's a lot of what they do very well. In the same way that, for instance, when we played Napoli, I was really impressed with it's little things, but Napoli would pass and miss a man out. So Liverpool's press would be triggered, Liverpool would go to where the normal, natural next pass would be, and Napoli would miss a man out. I thought Atleti were doing a bit of that, taking that gamble. But the other thing I think they did really well, Adam, was disrupt Liverpool from behind. So you think players were out the game, and they will come right the way back in and come absolutely harass whoever it is who's in possession. It was pressing, but it wasn't pressing in a conventional way. They were just finding little angles to trouble Liverpool when they were trying to get playing.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why the midfield disappointed as much as it did, because I don't think any of them really had a particularly good game, which I think also ties into why I'm not sure the manager's decisions across the board were right. I think that was probably one of the manager's worst games for some time in terms of the subs that he made. And I think that none of them came out of it particularly well. And, you know, Henderson, the injury is gutting, you know, and hopefully he's not out for very long. But Fabinho still doesn't look like he's up to speed at all. Wijnaldum, it was another one of those anonymous games. And I think it's really easy to look at it and go, none of them performed. But I think you have to look at what Napoli were doing to stop them from performing. Atletico to stop them from being able to perform, you know. And it's sort of, I always laugh at my dad because my dad always sort of refuses to acknowledge that there's any sort of opposition, and it's just Liverpool aren't doing well, aren't playing well enough. And you know, you've got to go, yeah, but look what Napoli are doing. You know, every time any of them are on the ball, they're looking up, and then there's a fella behind them. All of a sudden, that they think has gone out of the game, but he's there right back into it. I think that's a big part of why they disrupted us.
And I think the reason with that particular tactic why it works so well, because as you said earlier in the show, we've been really good all throughout the season of fixing problems in game and working out when someone's trying to do something for us and then being aware of it. And we noticed it, or I noticed it, and I'm sure you mentioned it, in the first half. And so you think, obviously, the analysts are going to mention it, someone's going to say, look, guys, keep an eye on behind you, keep it. But then it requires actually having eyes in the back of your head, which is a bit of a problem.
And you then discombobulate it, because if you are trying to keep an eye on what's behind you, you're actually less good at what's in front of you and the ball you're going to play.
And the timing of when they do it is really key as well, because if you think about when you're in a tight space, maybe the way that Joe Gomez does really well, or Wijnaldum, where they can kind of like work their way out of the space between the 2 or 3 defenders, then you think, okay, I'm through. Then you look up, and it's at that point when they're looking up to scan where to pass when they come back. So just when you've taken your mind off of that is when they get in. Or
someone's come from an unorthodox angle. That's the other thing that they were doing, especially on Gomez. The other forward would come and get involved in a way you normally not do, because you think, well, I've got to look after this space. But instead, and maybe that could have opened spaces up for Liverpool, but they weren't quite aware that this is the way in which they're going to play. And also the other thing you'd say from a Liverpool point of view is, don't expect them to necessarily do the same thing second leg.
No. I think that when it comes to the time we've got between the 2 legs, anything can be worked out around that. It definitely will be. And they're not going to be able to have that, the ability to just say, okay, I'm just going to leave that guy and just press him now, because there's going to be guys in red coming from all angles. They're not going to be able to do that. So I think we'll maybe be able to do it better. But again, I think in the home leg, our intensity will be better. The tempo will go up 10 or 20% anyway, which are going to make those things harder for them to do as well.
When you mentioned manager's subs, what would you like to have seen him do differently, and at what stage? I'm intrigued that Keita never gets on, for instance, haven't impressed as much as he did against Norwich, as far as I was concerned. And I was thinking it all looked very Naby Keita to me, like he could have opened them up, but the manager instead goes with firstly Oxlade-Chamberlain and then secondly Milner.
I have to say, I was quite surprised actually when everybody on the pink, the post-match of Norwich was praising Keita so much, because I didn't actually think he'd played that well. But I think what he offers is exactly what the game needed. You know, I mean, look, I'm not against him. I think the problem that we've got with Keita is that some people have built him up so much that he does a tiny little thing and they're all going, oh my God, that's amazing. And then there's other people that have sort of smashed him down so much that, you know, as soon, and I think he's somewhere in the middle. I think he can be a really good player, but he needs a run of games, he needs the fitness, he needs all that. I didn't think he was great against Norwich personally, but I still think I was crying out for him last night, because what it didn't need was Milner. Like that, I just thought Milner was the exact opposite of what that game needed in many ways, especially a Milner who's been out for as long as he has and basically has no rhythm whatsoever. And I didn't think that Wijnaldum was really doing much. So, look, obviously the injury forces the manager to make a decision, and the situation with Mane forced him to make a decision, and the fact that he wants to bring Salah off, as you say, in a pre-programmed manner. All of those force his hand, but I don't think he got any of them right. And Keita was the one where I was thinking, if you're going to do anything, do that.
Yeah, I would have personally done Keita at half-time with Mane coming off. I think I could have predicted the way that Origi's game was going to bear out, and it might have been better to hold him back for later, so he's got a shorter burst, so you just say to him, just empty your tank, just run around like a mad thing and maybe try and make something happen. I agree with you in terms of, I think that Keita is what that game needed. It might have been like we were talking about with the way that Atletico were getting people tackling back from behind, that's something that I've seen Keita do badly in the past, where he hasn't looked behind him and has been there. Maybe that was in Klopp's mind. But I agree with you guys. I think that he should have come in. I think even going back to the Norwich game, it seemed to me a little bit like a wavelength problem, as in he was thinking things that other people weren't thinking, and that was why there was a breakdown. So the best way to solve that is to play more often together, I think. But yeah.
Okay, thank you very much to Adam. Thank you very much to Mo. That's been our second look.